are live on a screen somewhere. How's that?
Okay.
Well, if we are, I can't find it yet, but
Oh, there it is. There it is.
Okay. All right. Okay, so we're actually live this time.
Start all over again. How you guys doing? Everything's great. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 25. Let's go.
Okay, so welcome to, I don't even know what this is called anymore. I'll say this, we're 5 minutes late because the internet seems to be causing all kinds of problems today. Edwin's with us. If you don't know Edwin, it's his last time to be on the broadcast because he's caused all the problems. Philip's here. He's pushing all the buttons. We're in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 25 starting. This is day 3 in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. We hope it's the last day. We just read through verse 31 with Edwin, and that didn't go out. So, Edwin, you did a great job. Can you reread that for us again?
Okay, absolutely. Absolutely. Here we go. We're going to start in verse 25. This is the English Standard Version. Now, concerning the betrothed, I have no command from the Lord, but I give my judgment as one who by the Lord's mercy is trustworthy. I think that in view of the present distress, it is good for a person to remain as he is. Are you bound to a wife? Do not seek to be free. Are you free from a wife? Do not seek a wife. But if you do marry, you have not sinned. And if a betrothed woman marries, she has not sinned. Yet those who marry will have worldly troubles, and I would spare you that. This is what I mean, brothers. The appointed time has grown very short. From now on, let those who have wives live as though they had none, and those who mourn as though they were not mourning, and those who rejoice as though they were not rejoicing, and those who buy as though they had no goods, and those who deal with the world as though they had no dealings with it. For the present form of this world is passing away.
All right, so we've been in chapter 7, like I said, for 2 days already. A lot of things have gone on there. We started off talking about this phrase, it's good for a man not to touch a woman. We noticed that a lot of this has to do with their present distress in Corinth with not only persecution, but also the idea of sexual temptation, which plays a huge role in this. And to this point, a couple of things, and also the marriage persecution of, and Edwin pointed this out yesterday, in that culture, if one person had converted to a different religion, there'd be a strong possibility that there'd be a temptation to end that relationship solely because of that. And I know that's foreign to us, but that plays a role in all of this as well. And so at this point, Paul's talked about, hey, my advice is if you're like me, if you're not married, stay that way. Practice self-control. If you can't practice self-control, then get married. But practice self-control, I think, was the overall emphasis there. And then the other thing is, we've kind of seen overall is from the idea of divorce, God's plan for marriage is for you to make it work, not to run to divorce, but to make it work. And in the process, your focus should be saving your mate and glorifying God. And we've talked about a lot of those things already. If you've not watched those broadcasts, that just kind of catches us up, kind of. Phil, I know you probably want to go a little deeper, but you're pushing all the buttons. Is that a fine enough synopsis for us to get going? Okay, so we get to chapter 7, and we're trying to get caught up a little bit here. And it's interesting, Edwin, as Phil continues to punch all the buttons, that we have this idea now of betrothment versus marriage, which for us, I mean, we don't talk about betrothment very often. I think sometimes people try to explain that away as the idea of engagement, but that's not really the same thing either. Maybe you could dive into that a little for us.
Well, the interesting thing on this is that the word that's translated betrothed in the ESV translators are giving a little bit of interpretive license on that. The word is actually virgin. And so
Correct.
As they're talking about the idea of the virgin, the ESV translators, and I'm not sure who else does that, they see that as referring to the person who has a, I don't know that I want to say legal connection, but it was much more than we think of with engagement. There was a connection, there was a promise, there was an expectation of marriage, but they weren't married yet. Is the idea that's going on here. And so now we're dealing with these question of if somebody is in that promised state, at least according to the ESV translators, if somebody is in that promised state, what are the requirements at that point?
Well, and one of the things I think is interesting is that idea of betrothment is really the condition we're introduced to Joseph and Mary in with the case of Jesus. There's an idea of betrothment there. She
Yeah.
is still, what's that?
Yeah, I just said yes.
And and that's what makes that she is a virgin, but she is with child, and that's why that makes that so interesting. Part of the betrothment too has to do with, at least my understanding is, there's a commitment, and remember, this is your family's involved in this, right? I mean, I think that's one of the things to kind of traditionally, there's been an exchange of a dowry more than likely in most cases. So all of that to say, this is a little bit deeper than engagement. In our society, if you're engaged and you just don't like somebody, you just cut that off and you argue about who gets to keep the ring. This is a little bit deeper than that. So with that in mind, he talks about this present distress and are you bound or are you free? And what's his overall kind of, I guess, suggestion, advice, however you want to say that. What does he say here, Phil, if you're with us?
I'm with us 100%.
Okay.
I think we have once again beat the internet into submission for at least the next hour. Thank
Don't
you,
say
Edwin.
that out loud.
No,
Yeah, you just cursed us.
No, we're good. We're good.
One last mission.
Yeah, one last mission. I'll say a couple of things. I think that as we've identified before, there's a sequence of events that take place to the church at Corinth that drive our picture. We've got a divided group who has divided themselves on the basis of who their favorite or most influential teachers were. I am of Apollos, I am of Paul, I am of Jesus, as the model that Paul responds to reteach them on the egalitarian nature of being in Christ in that sense. But secondly, we're going to see later some economic disparity in their behavior, which is kind of weird given the persecution model that they're in. And so with that, you've got a couple of things that are kind of balancing in priority there. So when it says present distress to these people who are, for whatever reason, in planning for their future, Paul is giving them, again, another layer of inspired insight into how to do so in a holy way and not be divisive like they had been in the past. And so the text is going to come up, particularly verses 26 through 28, that talk about the structure of that relationship are all kind of refined down to what's the holy outcome? How is this holy in sight of what God wants for them? And so I think there's some important aspects of that to pay attention to that we tend to move into the other category we talked about last week, which is, I don't like my marriage, I want out. And so that's not really what this is, at least on the first layer. There actually is some practical application that would find its place in a 21st century marital context, but that's like the second application layer, not the first one.
I think what we have going on here is in some degree hyperbole, exaggeration. For instance, Paul certainly cannot be saying, if you're married, act like you're not. He's not saying, if you're married, ignore all the stuff I've said about marriage, ignore all the responsibilities that you have as a husband or a wife. Clearly, there's some hyperbole going on within this paragraph. I think when we get down to the last verse, we get to see what the point is, and having arrived at that point, maybe then we can back up and reread the paragraph to get what Paul is actually trying to get across. And in that very last verse, those who deal with the world as though they had no dealings with it, for the present form of this world is passing away. His entire point is, we are not of this world. Our hope is not in this world. And therefore, whatever we do in this world, we have to keep eternity, resurrection, kingdom as the forefront of why I behave the way I behave. And I mentioned this yesterday, typing it in. I hate to use the old cliche, but it's that reminder, we are in the world, but we are not of the world. And so the things of this world must not have so much hold on us that it takes us away from eternity and resurrection. And what's really shocking for us, I think, is that marriage is on that list. But we have to remember that in the resurrection, we will not be married. And so as important as marriage is in this life, and as important as our discipleship is to marriage, and how much our discipleship will impact the way I behave as a husband and the way my wife behaves, we have to understand that marriage is not the ultimate hope. I'm not a better Christian because I'm married. I'm not a worse Christian because I'm single, because it's not about these things. If I'm married, be a Christian as a married person. If I'm single, be devoted to the Lord as a single person, because all of the things of this world are passing away. Wherever I am, slave or free, married, unmarried, able to buy things, not able to buy things, wherever I am, I need to remember that this is all about eternity, not about right now.
Well, in the context of 29 and 30, bear out the fact that he's not saying if you're married, act like you're not married. And anybody who tries to kind of push that idea here just ignores the idea of like, well, if you have stuff, act like you have no stuff. Nobody pulls the rich young ruler out of this passage and goes, hey, we got to sell all of our stuff and have nothing. Nor do they say, hey, you can never be happy or you can never be sad. But those are the other qualifiers in the context around there, which points to the idea that what he is not saying, he is not saying, hey, look, because of the present distress, you can't be happy, you can't be sad, you can marry. That's not what he's saying at all. So to your point, what this is a hyperbole saying, live without those anxieties. And I think that's going to tie into the next section even more. But this idea of, hey, look, with this life, there are things sometimes that they have burdens that come along with them. Yeah. And as long as you focus on the flesh and not, as you said, the resurrection, the eternity, what's ahead, spiritual things, then those, if that's your focus, then you're going to lose your focus on what matters in that sense.
Right.
So
I would kind of look at it this way. Terry will love this because he's going to be able to keep his little counter ticker going up.
We're going to the garden, folks. We're going to the garden.
In the way in which the Bible presents the human experience, it exists in the boundaries of the unseen realm. From heaven to heaven is kind of way to think about it. But in the middle of that, we have garden to grave. We have marriage that's been presented to us, but in the grave, that is no longer binding. We're not bound in that regard. So you've got Romans, kind of Paul breaking out that argument that death separates that bindery event. And so from garden to grave, marriage is the thing. But that's the small part of our experience. The large part of our experience is really the heavenly realm, the unseen realm, that is really difficult to quantify. And Paul talks a lot about that in 1 Corinthians 15, and he also uses as a standard theme maker there. And so, yes, our garden theology comment ticker goes 1.
Well,
here's what I want you to know, Phil. I don't get to be here every day. I think you're dead on about your point about the garden. We don't spend enough time there.
I agree with him. I just want us, Phil keeps updating the live stream background and graphics. I want a garden ticker down here in the bottom left-hand corner, right below all this chat box. And every time Phil mentions garden, we just increase by 1. You could even put a walkthrough clicker for my family. And every time somebody walks through, and we'll see who wins by the end of the broadcast. More garden references or Francis's? Which one wins? Because that would be a good competition for our live stream folks.
I would totally Black Sox that.
Yeah. Totally.
We could actually build a poll inside the Zoom chat to do that with no trouble at all.
There you go.
I just got to bring it over.
Yeah, absolutely.
Exciting stuff.
Back to the garden in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. Phil, we pick on you, but yes, we do agree with the garden analogy. It is great. And I don't know if I told Edwin, I slipped up twice Sunday and mentioned the garden in my own lessons. So I've been unduly influenced.
So 1 Corinthians 7.
Yeah. 1 Corinthians 7.
So
is this the point at which we've now gotten so wrapped up and poking at each other we've lost it?
Not at all.
Let's read verse 32 through 35, I guess. I don't know.
No, I think there's some things, because there's 3 sections, maybe 4 in this unmarried widow context. But there's one other thing I wanted to point out before we get to verse 32. And Paul is again kind of narrowing in on this as being a temporary thing. This is present distress context. So that's one of the reasons why I brought up that there's a certain part of these applications that are not for all time per se. What they are for any time where you have the kind of distress that Paul is talking about. That can be micromanaged in the sense of a community a place, a country, a nation, a few years. It could be personal. There's many brethren I know that their lives have created the conflict where they've decided it is better for them not to marry. Perfectly legitimate spiritual choice. Because being married or being unmarried is not the ticket into heaven. It is one of the choices we manage that God has given us the opportunity to work through. So I just wanted to kind of slide that in there as a box to make sure we think about it and process it before Terry reads for us verses 32, maybe to verse 35.
All right. I want you to be free from anxieties. The unmarried man is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to please the Lord. But the married man is anxious about worldly things, how to please his wife, and his interests are divided. And the unmarried or betrothed woman is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to be holy in body and spirit. But the married woman is anxious about worldly things, how to please her husband. I say this for your own benefit, not to lay any restraint upon you, but to promote good order and to secure your undivided devotion to the Lord.
Quick question for the both of you. The week before your wedding, did you understand this passage?
No.
I've been married for 25 years. I'm not sure I understand this passage.
Oh, I understand this passage.
I will say that both your answers are accurate from my perspective. Certainly didn't understand it then. The application side of it expands with responsibility. Paul has taken this kind of structure and applied it to marriage because that's where he's thinking about it. But in reality, the various things we bring into our table, they eat and chew at us for the priority of our time. That's our one unique limited resource that we allocate based on whatever's before us, and we prioritize those things in very simple ways. Comedically, you hear husbands and wives talking to their kids and look to their kids and say, look, I'm always picking the wife because you're going to leave me one day, which is accurate. And so there's aspects of that we think about. Then there's other stuff we put in that same realm. So what do you guys see in the text that you have learned since the day you were married?
Well, so you're asking this in terms of having learned this because of my own marriage experience. I don't want to act like my marriage has been filled with me being completely anxious about my wife, but
I think there's some context there too. But
the thing that here's what I'm seeing is tying it back to the previous paragraph, where in the previous paragraph he said, if you're married, act like you're not. Now in this paragraph, I think he explains what he means by act like you're not. Don't be so anxious about your marriage that you're not wholly devoted to the Lord, which is then going to tie back into everything else. Am I mourning? I have reasons to mourn right now. I've had family members die within the last week, not because of the COVID virus, at least not directly, though an argument could be made, but not directly. I have reason to mourn, and I'm allowed to mourn, but I must not allow my mourning to take me away from my devotion to Christ. I have reason at the same time to rejoice. Some good things have happened. I must not allow my rejoicing to take me away from my devotion to Christ. I've bought some things. What happens when I buy things? All of a sudden I have to care for things. I was looking at my car this morning and realized it needs to be washed again. Every time you buy something, you have to care for it. And so what his point here is again, keep your devotion wholly to the Lord. Don't allow any of these things that are going on in this life, even though you have to walk through these things, don't allow them to take you away from your devotion to the Lord.
So this passage to me probably at this point in my life is a little bit more personal because I could expand it beyond wife to just family. And for those who don't know, my father-in-law, my mom, and all three of my kids are locked with me in quarantine. There are 7 of us. And I mean, as a general rule, we're together most of the time. It is very easy on a lot of times for the anxieties related to that kind of a family model and all that goes in with that, for that to be a temptation and a stumbling block to your devotion to Christ. And that's the thing, I laughed when you said you tell your kids they're going to leave, so you're picking the wife. Be careful. You may have to move back in with the kids at some point. Live in that world.
Hey,
So,
listen, when you said that though, my mind immediately went to, I mean, I get it. I've actually said that to my kids quite frequently, but one of the things that I heard in that is that I have to say to my wife, I'm always going to pick Jesus, because one of these days you and I aren't going to be married.
correct. Yeah.
Yeah.
And look, I mean, and we joke around about it. Your kids need to know that they're not above your spouse. Your spouse needs to know she's not above the Lord. We know all of that practically. But what this is really talking about is, hey, look, with family comes a lot of anxieties. Let's just be honest. That's the reality. And here's one of the things I didn't understand. There's a part of me that thought, as kind of a naive 23-year-old, getting married was going to fix a lot of things in my life and it was going to be a lot better. And yeah, that's true to a degree, but there was a lot of other things that came along with marriage. And then, by the way, you come to a point like, well, we want kids, and that's like a very happy kind of thing. Oh, look, we want our own little bouncing baby boy, but that brings another level of anxieties with it. And so, what Paul's saying, I mean, look, there's a present distress here. I don't think his necessarily his suggestion to remain single is applicable to us today as it was for them. But what I do think you learn from this passage is just a basic understanding. When you have a family, there's a lot of things that come with that. It is a blessing. It's like kids. Look, I'm not saying kids aren't a heritage of the Lord, arrows in your quiver. We know that's all true, right? We know they're a gift and a blessing, but we all have kids, and even the best of kids bring anxieties with them, right? And so, again, to me, that's just one of the overall things from this text is, hey, look, if you have a family, realize that is going to be something. And by the way, Satan's really going to use that to the highest degree to pull you away as much as he can.
Hey, read
He'll use
Job.
your kids, he'll use your mate, whatever he can. So you got to go into that understanding. You're adding that level of attack to what you're going to carry at that point.
I think it was Gary Thomas in his book, The Sacred Marriage, and I can't remember the exact wording, but I really appreciated it. And he made, see if I can get it right here. He made the point that the great blessing of singleness is the unfettered ability to devote your life and your days to the Lord Jesus Christ. The great blessing of marriage is the, I'm trying to remember his wording now, but it was something like, is the tested ability, or is the testing, or the experience of becoming more like Jesus. Not that single people can't become like Jesus, and not that married people can't be wholly devoted to the Lord. But his idea is that whether single or married, I need to figure out what the blessing is that pushes me closer to the Lord. And in marriage and parenting, what pushes me closer to the Lord is learning to love someone who is, in sometimes, unlovable, just like they're having to do with me.
Yeah.
Someone who's different from me, someone who doesn't see things the way I do, I have to learn how to love them. And sometimes someone who sins against me. And as I learn that, I become holy as the Lord is holy. When I'm single, one of the great benefits of being single is not to spend all my day trying to figure out how to get married. When I'm single, the great benefit is, what can I do today to be devoted to the Lord? Now, that may lead to marriage eventually for some, but that doesn't have to be that way. And that's, neither is, I don't want to say that either is the ideal or the best. It's just, we're all supposed to be devoted to the Lord and use whatever situation we're in to draw us closer to the Lord.
Yeah, I think that's something that's important, on looking at the text a second time. You know that while we can see the obvious expansion of additional responsibilities and family and extended family, which is in some ways a biblical model of caring for one another as the families go through their various cycles, the focus here is very narrow. He's just talking about the husband and wife relationship. He's just talking about betrothal to marriage, and he's just talking about the present distress. All of those things, especially when we jump to the next part of the text, and we can do that right now, which is read verses 36 through 38. Edwin, do you want to read that for us?
Sure, 36 through 38.
Correct.
If anyone thinks that he is not behaving properly, sorry.
Oh, you're good. Just keep reading. We got you.
Okay. You can see me. My phone's ringing while I'm trying to do this. Sorry. All right. If anyone thinks that he is not behaving properly toward his betrothed, if his passions are strong, and it has to be, let him do as he wishes. Let them marry. It is no sin. But whoever is firmly established in his heart, being under no necessity, But having his desire under control and has determined this in his heart to keep her as his betrothed, he will do well. So then he who marries his betrothed does well, and he who refrains from marriage will do even better.
Right. And so I'll just make this quick, simple observation. Look, in the context of Paul's instructions, marrying, you're going to do well. If you choose to refrain from marriage, you will do even better. So the question is really simple. What's he talking about? Well, he's talking about the present distress and your devotion to the Lord. So in those two sliding scales of what's going on and what he's desiring for them, spiritual devotion, commitment to Christ, successful devotion and commitment to Christ, right now, single, better. It's not really, we overcomplicate it. I do that all the time. Like that's like one of my great challenges in life is taking that which is simple and making it complex. But certainly, that's a challenge for all of us to understand, especially when we begin to think about things in a temporary present distress, because a lot of us have thought through the idea that our current circumstances are a variation of a distressing period. Not the equivalent of Paul's by any means, but certainly one that's challenging.
So one of the things I found interesting here that I don't know that I'd ever really picked up on is he doesn't tell the betrothed guy that feels like he can control himself and not get married to become completely single. He actually says to keep her as his betrothed, which points to what you said earlier, Phil, that this is a temporary situation. He is in essence saying, hey, if you could put off marriage until this is over and then marry your betrothed, that's the advice that is actually given in that text. And I just think that's interesting. So you said about the current distress, there's we all know people who are supposed to get married this summer, and probably if you're like me, you have weddings that are scheduled that you're supposed to officiate this summer. That at this point you're going, are we going to have the wedding? Is the venue going to be open? What are we going to do? How are we going to do this? We know that the majority of those cases I know of people who are supposed to get married have basically already gone and done that. Some who are supposed to get married as late as June have already gone and gotten married in this present distress. There are some who will say, we'll just put that off. We can wait and we can delay. And to me, that's kind of the modern day present distress application of what he's saying. So I had just never seen that idea of keep her as your betrothed. And just to point out, he's not saying in the betrothment. He's saying put off the marriage. And when this is ended, then that changes.
Yeah, literally the family across the street, one of their children and their betrothed would have already been married now. And they've been jokingly saying, maybe we could sit down and talk about doing a backyard wedding ceremony for the two of them, because they don't know. They were already supposed to be in the home that they've purchased. They've already supposed to have shifted out of all of this temporal stay here. And so it is a layer of practical application. I would encourage the brethren that I know that, like Paul, it's okay to wait. There's no need to rush in any of these things as a general rule. Because I think Paul is basically encouraging that same behavior. It's okay to wait. It's going to be okay.
I just had a drive-in wedding in my head at that point when you said that, and the dad driving the bride in his car, and she gets up. Never mind.
Was it day 42, Terry? It's day 42.
Yes, day 42.
It explains everything. Edward, what else do you see in the text here?
There's going to be a fantastic movie about this, by the way. I hope one of us is in it. Anyway, back to the text.
One of the fascinating things here is, again, we've got translation choices made by the different translators because the word here for betrothed is still virgin. Mm-hmm. And then that becomes the question when it says his virgin. I mean, once the translators choose to make it betrothed, we automatically assume we're talking about the future husband with his future wife. But in the ancient context, when we recognize it's his virgin, it may actually be talking about the father and what the father is, how the father is pursuing the relationship of his daughter in the future. And so I think we have to keep that in mind as we're walking through this text, the different possibilities that we have here. And it's the idea, it may possibly be the idea of, look, a father who's saying, I'm not sure that you're getting married right now is the best thing, is not necessarily doing poorly in this present distress that they were dealing with. On the other hand, a father who sees the need for his daughter to be married, maybe because of we've already had the whole deal about the burning at the beginning of the chapter. For her, for him, either way, he's saying, look, it's not wrong. And I think we have to get back to that. No, so whether it's the father with his daughter or the husband with his betrothed, what we have is Paul says, and we struggle as we get into the weeds, which one's better? So which one should we really do? Paul's not saying one is better, so that's the one you should really do. Paul is saying both are okay. Because of the circumstances they're in right now, he thinks it's going to be easier for a person to be holy and devoted to the Lord in body and mind if they're not married. But neither one of these this is the one you should do. Both are lawful, both are allowed. And going back, Phil, to what you brought us up to speed on at the very beginning, was how Corinthians is all about the division that's going on in Corinth. I think what we have is a division over how to handle this issue. And Paul is coming in and saying, guys, you're both okay. You don't need to divide over whether you're going to have your daughter or you're going to marry your betrothed, whichever one it is. And you don't have to divide over this issue. They're both okay. Is one better at this time? Maybe. Is one more helpful at this time? Based upon the Lord's grace in me, I think it is, Paul says. But both are allowed. There's no need to get all upset at each other or to divide, but be united here. You're both doing well.
Yeah. We've got one more textual chunk that we can read through here. I'll read the last two verses for us, and then we can kind of overview the bigger picture to close things out. Verse 39, chapter 7. A wife is bound to her husband as long as he lives. But if her husband dies, she is free to be married to whom she wishes, only in the Lord. Yet in my judgment, she is happier if she remains as she is. And I think that I too have the Spirit of God. And so Paul begins, basically playing games with our heart here, because he's mixing things up that we want to be distinctly separate. We want his advice to be separate from the inspired writing. We want to have a discussion that's either present distress or all things or something else. And so he's kind of really pushing all those pieces into one box. And we're like, okay, now what are you talking about? Because he's shifted off the table of the betrothed, spouse, father-in-law, father, all that, to now he's talking about how a wife is bound to her husband. It seems like it doesn't belong in the same box, but yet it does, because it matches the bigger, longer context that he's been talking about. He tends to ramble like other folks we know. But with that, what do you guys see here? Verse 39, 40.
Well, I think if you put it in the context, to me, what it really says there is Paul kind of wrapping this up by saying, if you're married, it's a lifelong commitment of responsibility. And you plug that into everything that's been said about control, about anxiety, about all of those things. It's just like, for me, he's saying this is responsibility, a lifelong commitment. You're not free from this except for death. Now, I know there's other things in this chapter, but the overarching context is again, as I've said every day, Paul really emphasizing God expects you to be married, to remain married, and to work out your marriage to the glory of God. That's what the overall expectation is, even in this present distress. And I think that's part of just him saying, okay, as you said, you get married, you don't get married, both can serve God, both are okay. Do you realize if you get married, this is what it means? This is what it means. And that's how I take that. Edwin, you can go a little deeper.
I think you've covered it there. He's pointing out that marriage is for life, and you are bound to that person as long as you live. Here, the focus is on the wife with the husband. It is reminiscent of Romans chapter 7, where he makes those comments at the beginning of verses 1 through 3, where, of course, there he uses it as an illustration about Christian relationship with the law. I understand that, but it's still that idea that you're bound as long as he lives. And of course, in Romans 7, he says what that means is if she's joined to another while he's still living, she's an adulteress. And of course, we would see that going the other way as well. But if her husband dies, she's free to be married. And that kind of gets back into all of what he said. He's been talking about those who are married, those who are betrothed, those who are virgins, those all these things. Now he's talking about the widow. I think that the widow, he says, is free to marry, but I think that she will be better off if she doesn't. I mean, he's basically repeating what he said the entire chapter now in this particular situation. I do want to point out, I think Hal made a comment about us being passive aggressive earlier. I just want to point out we've got a little bit of that from Paul right here. I think I have the Spirit of God, he says. There's a little bit of that sarcastic dig, because his point is, look, all right, I'm giving you my opinion, but hey, remember, I have the Spirit of God, so my opinion does really count for something.
Yeah, there's a lot.
That's Paul saying that.
Right. I think there's a lot of the language tools that Paul pulls out of his, toolbox that help us get a deeper understanding of what we're supposed to capture. When he uses sarcasm, that's probably telling us that our attitude isn't really what it needs to be. When he uses gentleness and compassion, he recognizes that if you hear what he's saying, you're probably broken and need someone to pick you up. And so they tend to pull and push on our emotional state intentionally. They're designed to do that. That's how we work communication, and Paul does that really well. I'll add this, take a little trip down the textual things. What are you guys' thoughts on the term "only in the Lord"? I think that's something that is a phrase that comes up at times, and we've just got a couple minutes left. We can use it as part of our summary. What's Paul getting at there? What does he mean when he says "only in the Lord"? I've got a simple answer to it. I think you all might have some other insight there, and then we'll go around the horn real quick.
I want to hear everybody else's answer before I.
Careful.
Okay, just throw me under the bus.
I'll throw out. Here's
no,
what
I got it. I got it.
End zone.
Look, I know what we want to make this say, and I'm just not willing to go to the point and say you can only marry a disciple. To me, the understanding is you only marry in a way that is in the Lord, meaning scripturally authorized by the Lord, but also I would take that glorifies the Lord too. And in some cases, that could mean the person that you marry, you may have a right to marry, but that would not glorify the Lord. That's kind of where I'm at on that. So I'll be the guy that goes and says, I don't think that's what that's saying. Edwin, you can take the other side if you want and go from there.
Well, it may be that a widow is only supposed to marry, a Christian widow is only supposed to marry somebody who is also a faithful Christian. Certainly that is the most wise thing to do. I do not want to give any advice that encourages a widow or anyone to marry someone who is not a faithful Christian. However, I do not believe the phrase "in the Lord" here is Paul giving a law that says, here's this technical law, a widow is allowed to marry, but only if the guy's a Christian. "In the Lord" is used dozens of times throughout the New Testament, and it's used in various ways. I've heard folks make the claim that it only ever means being a Christian, but it's not used that way very often at all. It's used to say by the Lord's will, what the Lord wants, what the Lord has ordered, by the Lord's strength. And I think in the context, Paul has been giving us God's will about marriage. And here he's just saying, if the widow remarries, she needs to make sure to be doing it by the Lord's will. Now, I can find maybe in other places that it says only a Christian, and then that would be implied by "in the Lord" here. But if I can't find that, then I have to just let this be what the phrase means: only in the Lord, only according to the way the Lord has things done, only according to the way the Lord has things ordered.
Right. I would say I'm probably in general agreement with both of those comments from different edges. I do not believe that he's actually making a binding law in regards to who can marry who as an additional category here. That's settled in every other passage that marital information comes through. Who you have a right to marry is a separate discussion. In this context, the "only in the Lord" application tends to separate at least two things: Paul's advice from what God wants for us. So when he says "in the Lord," that is in some ways partially inclusive as advice. because he wants them to be devoted. He wants them to be committed. He wants them to do so in a way that honors God. There are like 50 uses in one of the major textbooks for in the Lord, and most of them have to do with commitment level, ideas. Committed to God, committed to all of this. But from a bigger perspective, it has nothing to do with whom you could marry. It's why should you marry? Why should you be bound together? And I'll suggest that on an application side of things, there's a way to think this through. In thinking about the person you choose to marry, know this, at least my observational experience is, it's one of the most radically significant choices you make that will determine your spiritual commitment. And Paul just told us that. He just told us that this relationship is so big, you may wait because of your personal circumstances to marry at a later date, or if at all. And we could survey every Christian I know, and come away with this simple conclusion. If they married someone who was not a Christian, or who wasn't committed to serving Christ, how much more of a challenge was that for their relationship? I know more people who married unbelievers or weak believers who no longer have strong faith than the opposite. Like by far, like any metric that you could possibly put together. And so I'll just, kind of lay that out with my understanding of in the Lord, it's about the commitment and the context. It's context there about present distress. It's context there about what we would then do as a consequence of that choice. So to the widow, to the married, to the unmarried, he says these repeated phrases: stay called, stay single, stay married. If you choose to be married, complete your marriage to the very end. I think there's kind of a maybe a stay-at-home context, if you want to be really punny with it, that we could see in all of this. So around the horn, Terry, since you just added 1 point to my ledger, what you got for us as the round the horn comments?
Well, are we going to ignore Chuck Richardson's question?
I did not even see it, so there's no intent to ignore.
Okay. From Paul's discourse, can we conclude that some opinions need to have more weight than others? From what is an opinion derived?
From his discourse here, I'm not certainly for sure. His opinion is heavier than mine. Paul's opinion, more weight than mine. I'll add this: as a young believer in a business meeting, age 22, growing in the faith, knew a lot of stuff. My opinion still weighed less than the mature believer with 30 years of life experience. And so on a simple practical level, it's always true that some opinions certainly are heavier than others.
And we've kind of danced around this issue a little bit, that this idea that parts of this are opinion and parts of this are binding may not be as great of a difference and distinction as we try to make it to get around the parts we want to call opinion. I mean, I think that's one of the things at the end of the chapter, the statement made by Paul about him having the Spirit. I think we need to kind of think about that. And we also need to remember that we're told that the things that the apostles bind, we're bound by. So, I think maybe that's a greater discussion. We're out of time, but I wanted to make sure and try to answer his question. I'm not sure there's as much opinion here as we want to act like there is. I think perhaps the better explanation of some of the things here is they are things that are related specifically to a present distress. I think we say opinion sometimes to try to get around us having to pay attention to that, where the better contextual thing is to say, hey, this is a present distress issue. That means that we look at this, there's principles there, but even those opinions that Paul says are things we really need to give a lot of kind of credit to. And like you, I think that there is, you could say it this way, as far as weight of opinions within the church, the shepherd's opinion matters more than my opinion in that sense. And we've got to compare that with scripture and so forth. But I think that's one of the things to kind of keep in mind. Yeah, there is that. But in this text, I'm not sure this is the text to really necessarily go a deep dive on opinions from my standpoint. Evan, I'll let you kind of
My
comments?
struggle is with just the word opinion. I think there are so many ways we can use that word. I mean, there's a sense in which opinion is everything I believe. I hear preachers as they argue about the difference between faith and opinion. I I mean, guys, let's just be honest. Everything I believe as the faith is my opinion that it is the faith. Because there are people out there who disagree with me and they will make their arguments against me. I don't think their arguments are true. Um, I don't think they're that's why I have my opinion. So I'm struggling. When I first saw this question, though, I was thinking of it in a different light. I'm not sure how Chuck was meaning it, but I was thinking about, right now we're in the midst of some real struggles that people are having about congregational assembling and that sort of thing, and everybody seems to have their opinion. And I think some folks are willing to say, yes, this is a matter of opinion, but my opinion is better than your opinion. And in Paul's statement here in this discourse, Paul does suggest that there is a better thing, but he also points out that both sides of this are lawful. And I think the overall point is, so don't spend all your time arguing about it. Don't get distracted by that. Be devoted to the Lord.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think what Paul presents is here's a wiser choice than this other choice, but both are good choices. And I don't know necessarily that labeling them opinion doesn't then bind them any less or have any less value to that. So,
well, and think about what we do. I'm sorry. Think about what we do with this passage, because he says there's this wiser choice. We then turn around and say, well, then is Paul saying this is what we should do? No, what Paul says is either one is lawful. And there's no sense in us taking Paul saying this is a wiser choice up to the level of this opinion is better, so this is the one you're really supposed to do.
Yeah.
And I think that's what we do in some of these discussions. Even when we'll admit, it's all opinion, but my opinion's better than yours, so this is what we should do. Anyway, that's going to get into all kinds of other application beyond this text.
Back to the horn. Just Phil, appreciate your work. Today's been a technical mess, and I know that that makes you want to pull what little hair you have left out, but we appreciate your work for this. And thanks, Edwin, for joining us. And I guess we'll let you back on. But if we have any more technical difficulties next time, you're done for. You're done. Just serve the Lord today. We are in a present distress. Remember, He's the focus. Don't get bogged down by some of this stuff, and focus on the Lord and keep your mind focused on things above. Edwin?
I want to reiterate, I mean, as soon as I got on this, even earlier than everybody else is getting on here, there were troubles and struggles, and Phil, you do a masterful job keeping up the teaching part of it, the discussion part of it, and trying to keep the technical part going. I know there are glitches and struggles, but I really appreciate your hard work on that. Thank you very much. Thank you guys for letting me be a part of this. And I want to reiterate, I do think the main point in this whole chapter is stay wholly devoted to the Lord. Whether married or unmarried, no matter what situation you're in, stay wholly devoted to the Lord, and let's keep our hope in eternity, not in this life. And that's what I'm going to be shooting for today.
Yep. Edwin, Terry, thanks for being with us. All the guys I know who are doing streaming of various economic levels, the guys who are doing it on the budget like we're doing, the guys who are doing it professionally for high-end productions, all of them are struggling. So I don't really feel that bad when things don't work that well right now, because it is what it is.
By the way, tonight's going to be fun to watch the NFL draft. I'm predicting tremendous struggle bus at some point, because they're doing this 32 teams wide. I know that Edwin doesn't care about that, but he should imagine all the Lord of the Rings trying to be on Zoom at one time. That's his.
Yeah, I mean, I'll probably be watching Lord of the Rings.
Yeah. I think I'm going to be hoping for the rain to stop and build a fire outside. That's my goal. Nobody can use the internet to interrupt that, I think. But thanks for being with us today. We really appreciate your presence. Thanks for hanging in with us. If you've got questions about this chapter,